Have you ever felt that spine-chilling sensation of being watched, even when you're alone at home? The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl and your heart race for no reason? Imagine this. You're in the comfort of your own home, doors locked, lights dimmed, and yet something doesn't feel right. What if someone or something has been watching you this entire time? Tonight, we dive into true stories of terrifying encounters, stalkers that lurk in the shadows, and chilling experiences that will make you question your safety, even in your own house. These are not just stories. These are nightmares that turned real. Our first story begins with Emily, a young woman living in a quiet neighborhood. It was supposed to be a peaceful night. She had just moved into her new home, settling in with a cup of tea, when she began to feel it, the undeniable sensation that she wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, little noises, like footsteps echoing in the hallway when she was sure no one else was home, the creak of the floorboards, the faint sound of something scraping against the wall. Emily tried to ignore it. It's just the house settling, she told herself. But then it happened again and again until one evening she caught a glimpse of something through her window, someone standing across the street, staring at her home. But when she looked away and then back again, they were gone. Terrified, Emily called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the figure had never existed at all. But as the days went by, Emily started to notice more things. Her front door, always locked, was ajar, and sometimes things she didn't remember touching would be moved. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, she heard a tapping at her window. Slowly, she turned to see the shadow of a figure standing outside in the dark. She froze, and just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. But something inside her knew this wasn't the first time. Someone had been watching her for weeks, and they knew she was alone. Let me take you back to a night that felt like any other, but quickly turned into a waking nightmare. Sarah was home alone. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards. She had just finished dinner, settled in to watch her favorite show, and felt completely safe. But then the phone rang. Sarah picked it up, but there was no one on the other end. Silence. She hung up, dismissing it as a prank call. But the phone rang again. This time, she answered with a trembling hand. "Hello?" she asked, but all she heard was breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. Panic set in as she slammed the phone down, heart racing. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Another call. This time, a voice whispered, "I'm outside." Frozen, Sarah's mind raced. Was someone really outside? She went to the window and peeked through the blinds, but saw nothing. Her front yard was empty, and the street was dark, with no sign of life. She breathed a sigh of relief until she turned back to the door. The lock on her front door was turning. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The breathing on the other end of the phone had started again, more frantic this time, and it felt like it was coming from right behind her. With trembling hands, she reached her phone and realized it was still in her hand. The whisper came again, closer this time. "I'm inside." To this day, Sarah doesn't know how she made it through the night. The police found no evidence of anyone in the house, no signs of forced entry. But Sarah knew the truth. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones we can see, but the ones who know how to make us believe they're right behind us. Now, let me tell you about Mike. He was a young man, living alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. One night, he had just finished a long shift at work, and all he wanted was to relax and get some sleep. Little did he know that night was going to be anything but peaceful. He was lying in bed, eyes barely closed, when he heard the faintest sound, like a tap, tap, tap against the window. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was enough to make him pause and listen. At first, Mike dismissed it. Probably a tree branch swaying in the wind, he thought. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. He sat up, staring at the window across the room. There was no tree outside, no branches swaying in the breeze. Mike felt the hairs on his arms stand up as his mind raced. He decided to check it out, convinced it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. As he walked toward the window, the tapping stopped. Silence. Mike pulled the curtain back, heart pounding in his chest. He saw nothing. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, but there was no sign of movement. He let out a sigh of relief, but just as he turned away, he heard it. "Mike!" The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it came from outside. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. No one should have known his name. Mike rushed to the door, checked the locks. Everything was secure. He thought about calling the police, but felt a strange sense of dread creeping up his spine. What could he tell them? That someone was whispering his name outside his window? He didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, when he checked his window, he found a note pressed between the glass. It read, "I know you're alone. I'll be back." Mike never saw anyone outside his window again. But every time he looks out into the dark, he feels like someone's watching, waiting. And every tap, every shadow makes him wonder who's really out there. Now, let me tell you about Laura. Laura had always been the type to love living alone. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of her apartment, the solitude that allowed her to focus on her work and hobbies. But one night, everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and she had just gotten back from a late dinner with friends. Tired, she locked the door behind her, turned off the lights, and collapsed onto her couch, scrolling through her phone as the evening slipped into night. It was getting late, so she decided to call it a night. As she headed to her bedroom, she heard something strange, a soft tapping sound coming from the bathroom, just down the hall. She paused, confused. It was too quiet to be anything more than her imagination, but there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Laura shook her head, telling herself it was just the pipes or a loose window. She shrugged it off and went to bed, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep, but that peace would never come. Around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by the sound of the tapping once again. But this time it was louder, more insistent, as though something was trying to get her attention. She could feel her heart begin to race. The tapping came from the bathroom, but now it was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper. "I'm here, Laura." She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whisper sounded too close, too real. She hesitated for a long moment before getting out of bed. Her legs were weak with fear, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Slowly, she crept down the hallway toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. The light from the hallway cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. She pushed it open, but the room was empty, just as it should have been. But when she turned to leave, she noticed something in the mirror. There, written in what looked like fog, were the words, "I'm already inside." Terrified, Laura ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. She checked every lock, every window, but nothing felt safe. Something had crossed the line, something that shouldn't have been there. And that night, she didn't sleep a wink. To this day, Laura can't explain what happened. She moved out of that apartment, but sometimes, when she's alone at night, she still hears that tapping. And she can't help but wonder, was something truly in the bathroom that night? Or was it something else, waiting for her to let it in? Now, let's talk about Julia. Julia lived in a small, quiet neighborhood, far from the chaos of the city. It was a kind of place where everyone knew each other, and you could walk down the street without ever feeling unsafe. At least, that's what Julia thought, until one fateful evening. She had just returned from a late shift at the hospital, tired and ready for a peaceful night of rest. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. As she entered her home, she felt the familiar comfort of her routine settle in. Lock the door, change into pajamas, and sit down to unwind. But something was different that night. Something she couldn't put her finger on. She sat on the couch, tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Her eyes constantly flicked to the windows, the door, as if expecting someone to be there. Her instincts were on high alert, but she couldn't explain why. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a message. It was a number she didn't recognize. "I'm watching you." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She checked the message again, convinced she had made a mistake. But the number was unfamiliar, and the message was chilling. She didn't respond, thinking it was a prank or some sort of wrong number. But then the messages started coming faster, one after the other. "I see you through the window. You can't hide. I know everything about you." Terrified, Julia rushed to the windows and checked the street. Nothing. No one was there. Her hands trembled as she locked the doors and closed the blinds. But as she walked back into the living room, the lights flickered. Then the power went out entirely. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw a new message, this time with a photo attached. It was a picture of her, sitting on the couch, taken from outside the window. Her breath caught in her throat. She checked the blinds again. Nothing. No one outside. No one could have taken that picture. She called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, everything seemed normal. The doors were locked, the windows were secure, and there were no signs of anyone outside. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in her home, someone who knew everything about her. The police could find no trace of the stalker, but Julia never felt safe again. Every time the lights flickered or her phone buzzed with an unknown number, she remembered that photo, and as she lay in bed at night, she would stare at the window, wondering, was she really alone, or was someone always watching, waiting for the right moment? Julia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. No matter how many times she locked the doors or checked the windows, she felt like something or someone was still out there, lurking just beyond her view. The days went by, and the messages continued, growing more disturbing with each one. One night, she received a new text. This time, it wasn't a photo, but a simple, chilling sentence. "I'm closer than you think." Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room, trying to make sense of the message. The lights flickered again, but this time they stayed dim. The house felt cold, much colder than usual. She wrapped herself in a blanket and tried to relax, but the fear was overwhelming. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, as Julia was preparing for bed, she heard a soft scraping sound coming from the hallway outside her bedroom door. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She froze, listening intently. The sound stopped. Then she heard again, closer this time, like footsteps scraping along the floor. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. But before she could dial, the door to her bedroom creaked open. No one was there, but the door had opened. The sound had stopped. Everything was eerily still. Julia stood there for a moment, frozen in terror, before her phone buzzed again. She quickly checked the message, expecting another chilling line. But this time, the message was different. It was a video, a short clip showing her own front door, slowly creaking open. The timestamp read 3:07 a.m., just moments before she had heard the scraping sound. The video was timestamped on her phone, taken just seconds ago. Her breath caught in her throat. The front door was locked. There was no way anyone could have opened it without her hearing it. Yet, the video clearly showed it opening by itself. What made it even worse was the soft sound in the background, a whisper that clearly said her name. "Julia, I'm in your house." The video ended abruptly, and the phone went black. Julia could hardly breathe. She was too terrified to move. The room felt colder, and the silence was unbearable. She could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. In a panic, Julia ran to the living room and looked out the window, hoping to see anyone outside. But the street was empty. Nothing. No one. The lights were still flickering, and the air felt unnaturally cold. She thought about leaving, but fear kept her frozen in place. And then she heard it, the scraping sound again, this time directly behind her. She whipped around, her eyes wide with terror, but saw nothing, just the dark corners of her home, empty and still. The fear was overwhelming, and the thought struck her. Was this all in her mind? Or had the person or thing who had been watching her finally made their move? That night, Julia locked herself in her bedroom and didn't sleep a wink. Every small sound made her heart race. She could hear footsteps in the hall, whispers in the walls, and a constant tapping that never seemed to end. But when the morning light finally came, she found something that would haunt her forever. The note slipped under her door. "You can't hide from me forever." Julia moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. She couldn't stay there any longer, but as she drove away, she looked at her phone once more. There, in her message inbox, was one final text. "I'm closer than you think, and I'm coming for you." She deleted the message, but as she looked out the window, she could have sworn she saw a shadow standing just across the street. And in that moment, she realized the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Julia moved far away, to a new town, to a new life, or so she thought. The apartment she found was everything she wanted. Peaceful, quiet, and far from the chaos she had left behind. She felt safe again, away from the fear that had haunted her for so long. But every time she walked into a new room, every time she locked the door, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. Was she really free? One evening, as she was unpacking boxes, she found something unexpected hidden at the bottom of a bag. Something she didn't remember packing. It was a small, folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. "I told you you can't hide from me. I'm always watching." The note was in the same handwriting, the same chilling message. But this time there was something more, a drawing, a crude, detailed sketch of Julia's new apartment, with a window facing the street and a shadowy figure standing just outside, peering in. Julia dropped the note, her heart pounding. She didn't know how it had gotten there, but she knew one thing for sure. This nightmare, the stalking, the fear, it had never really left her. The doorbell rang. Her body froze. She cautiously walked to the door, her pulse racing. She checked the peephole. No one was there, just a dark, empty hallway outside. She opened the door, and there was nothing, no one. But as she closed it, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a figure standing just beyond her window, watching her from the shadows. The shadow didn't move, but Julia could feel it. She could feel it staring back at her. And in that moment, she knew whatever was following her, whatever had been watching her all this time, it wasn't just some person. It was something far worse, something that never let go, and it would never stop. The nightmare was far from over, and it would never end, not until it got what it wanted. And Julia had no idea what that was.